Welcome to TESO Consulting Group's DEI podcast series, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadow of Resistance. I'm Dr. Tonya Breland.
And I am Erika Lee.
Welcome back. They came back.
They came back.
So this is, as you know, Why Is This So Hard? Shining Through the Shadow of Resistance. That's our podcast series.
Yeah, we've been having a really good time.
We have.
And we hope that you have too. So let's get into today's
Just
topic.
in case you didn't know, I'm Tonya.
And I'm Erika.
So today we want to talk about something that most of you might think is just related to students and kids, but we're going to show you how this conversation about AP enrollment is actually really significant in society.
It is. It is. It has, like everything through school, it just has repercussions and it reverberates in other areas of life. And so sometimes I think some people think that it's not that big a deal, that Black and Latino kids are underrepresented in AP and honors enrollment, but it actually has, some lasting effects in our society concerning the way that we recognize people.
Right, yeah. And we're going to kind of make some ties so that you can see the connection, post-secondary in terms of like where people go to college, what kind of jobs they have, where they can live, whether or not they have access to healthcare. All of that can tie into something like AP
honors,
enrollment.
Gifted and talented, those kinds of programs. Because what we're really talking about is access.
Right.
We're really talking about access and the opportunity to engage in rigorous instruction, or even just to be recognized for being able to, somebody having faith in you that you can actually, complete harder coursework. It actually goes a long way.
It does.
I think.
So I don't know what schooling was like for you when you were a kid, but I grew up mostly in Ohio. And so I grew up in Akron, Ohio, and the side of town that we lived on, my school was predominantly Black. But what we experienced as kids was something that some of you may know as a term called tracking. So if you were in on the honors track, started in elementary school. So in elementary school, they identified people as gifted and talented. So I was one of the students that was identified as gifted and talented. My brother was not. And we came from the same household, similar experiences, but for whatever reason, they're like, okay, she can be in it, but he's not in it. And so they put us in the various tracks, if you will, and those tracks carried us all the way through high school.
Yeah.
So by the time I got to high school, my brother and I went through school together, and so we were both in the same grade from like first grade on up, and so we were in the same homeroom in middle school, the same homeroom in high school, and we had a class here or there together at different times, but when it came to certain courses, I was in the honors and or AP courses, and he was in the college prep courses or the regular ed courses, if you will.
And what happens with tracking is your classes actually become kind of pre-populated. So it literally is a track, right? So your classes for 10th grade are determined by what you took in 9th grade, right? And so that really is what tracking is. My experience was a little different. So I didn't go to an all-Black high school, but my high school was integrated. And so, it was a diverse. In an earlier episode, I talked about how I watched the change of demographics in terms of my community. And so when I was in school, the gifted and talented in elementary, the gifted and talented programs, mostly white kids, right? And then in middle school, those honors programs, Willingboro, well, that's where I'm from, Willingboro, New Jersey. It had this, they had this program or this track that if you were identified as gifted and talented in elementary, which really meant that you were a good reader. I mean, I'm not going to get into how they identify kids, but so you didn't have to take reading in 7th grade. You actually could take Latin And so in 7th and 8th grade, and then for me in 9th and 10th, I just took Latin. I took Latin 1 through 4. And so it actually provided a really nice foundation for me in terms of reading and even spelling and understanding words and etymologies and all of that.
Ergo, the English teacher.
Ergo, the English teacher, that's right. But that got started. That was the access that I had in 7th grade. And so that when I went to my guidance counselor year after year, it was, well, your, honors, your AP, this is sort of the track that you're going to take. And it was predetermined for me, really.
Right.
If I wanted to take at that time it was like CP, so it was college prep, which was sort of like the middle road. If I wanted to take those classes, I almost had to get like parental permission. But in those classes, they were predominantly white kids, and so the CP classes and the special needs classes, they were predominantly Black kids, and it really became almost like this space. There's a great book called Despite the Best Intentions. And it really is about how kind of like racism and tracking flourishes in integrated schools and suburban schools. And so I really saw one of the things that they say is that those AP and those honors classes were considered white classes. And we kind of had that same perception. We just thought that those were the white classes. And as an African American student, I can tell you that it had repercussions on me socially, right? Because it's like, who am I going to hang out with? Kids hang out with the kids who they go to classes with. And so it was a bit of a challenge.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
It's interesting, the statistics that, well, not statistics, but the example that you just gave really mirror some of the national statistics that we see related to who's enrolled in AP and honors courses.
Yes.
So we're looking at, and it's disproportionate, by the way. So like 15% of the student population across the country are Black students, but only 9% of them are enrolled in AP courses. And that's really significant because we're talking about a really low percentage of Black students who are enrolled in these courses. And so then you have to ask the question, why is that?
Yeah. And I think that's really the golden question, right? So what's happening here that our students, our Black and brown students, are underrepresented in AP and honors and gifted and talented. Why aren't they being identified? Why aren't they being encouraged? Why aren't they just allowed to enroll in these courses? And so when we think about that, we think about sort of the ways that kids are marginalized for whatever reason. And I think, unpacking that is going to be really important.
And so as you were talking, I was thinking about who's in these classes and who's allowed to be in these classes, but not only who's allowed, but even, there are there are reports that I've heard where, Black students who may be allowed to be, meaning they are academically, astute enough, if you will. I don't even like saying that, to be enrolled in these courses. They don't want to enroll because they don't feel like they belong. They don't feel like it's a place for them to be.
And remember on Maslow's hierarchy, right? So belonging is before achievement. So before I can get to that place where I achieve or accomplish, I got to feel like I belong in these spaces. And if I don't feel that, I'm not really going to even want to be in those in those classes where I may not feel like I belong.
I do think it's good that there are some school districts currently who feel like, this is a problem. And they're willing to take the steps to detrack students, which is, by the way, a problem for some parents, i.e. some white parents, unfortunately, because AP courses traditionally was set up for white students, and there was kind of a separation there where they, when integration happened, they wouldn't have to be in courses and classes with, students of color.
Well, it was almost like, I don't want to say an agreement, but it was a concession, right?
Sure.
So we'll integrate, we'll allow African American students, we'll allow students of color into the district to be educated, in the same building, but we will separate them in terms of classes. And that really is what kind of made it more palatable.
Right.
For white parents.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think a lot of people know that history.
No, I don't think so.
But it's really important that we talk about that, because that's why we're in this state right now where there's an underrepresentation of Black students and students of color. So Latino students make up about 20%, I believe, nationally. And even that also is disproportionate to the number of Latino students that we have in our schools across the country. And so, when we think about like, okay, so then, now that we know this information, now what, so what? Like, what do we do about this?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think one of the challenging tasks that we have is to really unpack bias. So why don't we see the promise in kids, in sort of, why are there patterns to the promise that we see in kids?
Yes.
Why are some kids overrepresented and some groups underrepresented? Like, why is that? And I think if we start to unpack that, I also think, the way that we identify kids. So what measures are we using to identify kids who are gifted and talented or can handle rigorous honors or AP work? Like, what method are we using, and are those methods valid? Are they accurate in terms of identifying who can, access or handle, more rigorous coursework?
Well, quite honestly, more kids can handle that rigor
Sure.
than you expect. And the truth is, when schools present students with rigorous instruction that is engaging and that's relevant, that's a whole nother conversation about, being culturally relevant and culturally responsive and or sustaining in pedagogy. That's a whole nother conversation that we will have at some point.
We will have it.
Because we can't help it. These are things that are important to us. But, students who have exposure to rigorous curriculum actually do better in general across the board. Even if they're not getting A's in these honors or AP courses, they're going to be better off than having been tracked in a college prep or a lower track class in general.
Yeah. They will live up or down to our expectations.
Absolutely.
Right? And so that really, I think that's a really good point. Even if they don't get an A, right? Even if they don't get an A, even if they don't get that B, they are still exposed to that rigorous, those rigorous expectations. And that has academic and it has social implications as well.
Right.
But I think at the end of the day, it also means that, when we say to a student, we have the faith in you that, yes, you may have some challenges in this area, or maybe you didn't get all A's in this area, or maybe, whatever that is.
Let me interject even more, because they may have gotten those, but they also may not have gotten instruction that was even respectful.
Sure.
Meaning they've been given menial tasks. Now, we recently visited a school where we visited classrooms, and sadly, the majority of the students in those classrooms were students of color.
Yes.
And the teaching staff was I would say relatively diverse.
I think so.
However, every single class we walked into, they were doing whole group instruction, and they were using worksheets. So
now, one thing about us, you have to know, we're former classroom teachers, and we despise worksheets.
Absolutely.
We actually think they're unjust.
They are. They are.
Because the truth is that kids have the right to be engaged in rigorous instruction. They really need to be challenged.
Yes.
Right? Because if you think about, particularly young children, they're so curious.
Yes.
Right? They're so curious.
Right.
And they learn through play. That's
right.
what all the research shows us. So why then are we walking into classrooms and seeing 5 and 6-year-olds with worksheets?
Right.
Like, it is just, even up to high school, there are different ways to engage kids There are different ways to teach them. Kids come to us with all kinds of
Talents.
interests, talents, abilities, motivations, preferences, styles, like all of that. And it is our job as educators to just engage all of that and to take advantage of their advantages, their gifts, and their talents.
Right.
And so we'll probably talk about this again, but we are so anti-worksheet.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
But
yes.
what ultimately is happening in classrooms like that, and quite honestly, that was just, last week.
Yeah.
But, it could have been any given week in any given school across this country that we could have been walking into classrooms looking at the same thing. I mean, there was a study, TNTP actually did a study where they were looking at, rigor in the classroom. They were looking at curriculum. They were looking at what was going on with, students of color in the classroom. And they found, sadly, that the instruction was subpar, quite honestly. And these are our own words, we're breaking it down.
No, but that's absolutely right. It's in the opportunity myth. And I think it was released, in 2018 or 2019. And that's exactly what they found, that, kids of color were more likely to, just have, I like the word you use, subpar instruction. They were not engaged. And the work that they were given, what they were taught was not on grade level.
Right.
So if I'm in 10th grade and you're giving me 8th grade work, you are wasting my time.
Absolutely.
You are wasting my time. And you're setting me up
for failure.
For failure.
That's correct.
To not be successful.
So we talked about that connection to, beyond education. This is not just an education problem. This is a problem that extends beyond education. So now we look at students who do not have exposure to rigorous instruction or high quality instruction. And so what happens to those kids when they graduate, if they graduate from high school? What happens to them? What kind of jobs are they qualified for? What kind of colleges could they get accepted into? All of that now sets those kids up, soon now future adults, up for a life of struggle. Because if you don't have the opportunities,
that's it,
extended to you, either academically, educationally, or even in terms of job skills, then you're going to be in a position where you're going to be doing menial labor. Making wages, not earning salaries, not getting health insurance, not being able to afford to purchase your own home or live in communities where the school districts are rated higher. Like, there's a whole bunch of implications that are far-reaching when we look at what happens to kids who are not given the kind of instruction that really all kids should have exposure to.
Absolutely. And I think it's that recognition that you deserve more, right? So if I, have this subpar education, I'm in this subpar class, kids know that there are honors classes. They also know that there are special needs classes, right?
They do.
So if I never get that recognition that, you can be in this honors class, even the word honor, right? Like, what does that say for everybody else?
I didn't think about that.
You're not honorable.
Exactly. Oh my gosh.
And so when we think about that, think about the nomenclature. When we think about sort of, kids in honors classes, they go on more trips. I mean, they did when I was in school.
Yes, they do.
They had these really wonderful opportunities that the other kids didn't get.
Right.
So if I'm one of the other kids from K to 12, what is the expectation for me?
Right.
What am I expecting of myself?
Right.
Like, I'm not an honors kid, so I probably won't be recognized. I probably won't get awards. I probably won't be, like those kinds of things.
You won't get scholarships.
I won't get scholarships. If I go to college, what am I going to, if I get the opportunity to go, what am I actually going to do? What do I expect of myself? Right? And so I think when we think about that, I think it's like those implications in terms of society, but also internally, intrinsically. What does that mean for what I expect? That means that honors, that means that those gifted programs, those are for other people. They're not for me. And if you think about now in today's workplace, there's all kinds of like teacher of the year, employee of the month, you get a special parking space or whatever that is. do I feel that I deserve that? Because I never got it before. And I think that that's something that we don't really sort of, when you're in AP and honors, you expect good stuff, right? You expect, because you're in honors, you're an honors student, you're honorable. So you expect good grades. You have the agency and the voice to talk to your teacher when you don't get those good grades. You expect scholarships. You are coached on how to apply for those scholarships, right? And you are also coached on how to apply to those better schools.
That's correct.
So the Ivy Leagues, the better HBCUs, like you're coached, right? And you get this sort of, and so you expect more for yourself, but you're also coached in terms of how to get more for yourself. Right.
And then everyone else expects more from you. So
That's
now we're talking about a mindset of those who are working with these students.
That's right.
So they have a certain expectation of certain kids. The honors and AP kids, they expect those students to be successful. They expect those students to get awards and scholarships and to go to college, to four-year colleges. They expect those students to be successful. And so imagine now you're that kid, or you're any kid in school, and either you're the kid who has the adults expect you to do great things, and or you're the kid who the adults don't expect you to do anything. And then that self-fulfilling prophecy can become true in either situation, in either case. I mean, there's some other implications, but just think about just that one piece for a moment. So being in AP as a high school student, there was an expectation that I was going to go to college. And I sat down with a guidance counselor and we talked about, my options and the opportunities that were available to me. I don't know that my brother had those same conversations.
Oh, I know. My older brother did not.
Yeah.
I know my older brother did not. I mean, the expectation was work or the service. I mean, that really was, and I have four brothers, but one of them in particular, it was really, you were going to, one brother was an athlete. And so it was like, well, you can get a scholarship.
Right.
So that was different, right? But the one of my brothers that wasn't, I mean, the opportunities, he just didn't have the same kinds of, exposures and expectations that I had, and so that meant that we were in the same building, but he literally went to a different school. He went to a different school. He had different teachers, different expectations, different work, right? Different track, and the outcome was different.
Yep. Yeah, and that is significant right there.
Yeah.
Now, what was different for my brother and me was we came out of a household where college was the expectation. So it was an expectation in our family that we were going to go to college. My brother actually wanted to go into the service, and it was like, no, you're going to go to college, and he did. It wasn't what he wanted to do,
right?
But it was something that there was an expectation around that, and so. We're again now talking about, and in that case, the family had influence on what the trajectory of the students were. But when some students don't have that benefit of the family being able to push them or having those expectations, because this is a cyclical issue.
Sure.
So these children are the children of parents who also had schooling experiences that were disrespectful.
Yeah.
And so the cycle continues.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I think the part about the parents and the how significant it is. I remember when I was teaching that there were kids who I taught like a 9th grade honors English class. And one of the things that was always kind of interesting to me was, a lot of kids were in that class because the parents were like, I want them there.
And they advocated.
And not all kids had that. And I know for me, like my parents advocated, but we were also first generation. So my parents, they knew that they wanted us to go to college, but they weren't really sure, with every kid, they learned a little bit more, right? So they weren't quite sure like of what classes were important for us to take in order for us to get there. They figured it out, but how important is it for a kid to have advocacy, right? And so how important is that? And if they don't have it, right? What happens, what happens? And if they don't have it at home because they don't know, or if they don't have it at school.
And the system is set up so that they're not going to have it because it's teacher recommended in a lot of school systems.
Yes.
And if those kids aren't favored by their teachers.
Which very often is about behavior.
Yes.
Very often it's not about academics.
Right.
Very often it's about behavior. And if kids don't have the behavior that is palatable to teachers, then, they just don't recommend them for honors, AP, or what have you, or gifted and talented.
Right, and we know that a lot of students, Black students in particular, are extremely intelligent and may act out because of the disrespectful instruction that's happening. They're not being challenged in class.
Right. That's right.
Like I remember when, and my kids weren't behavior problems, but I remember when my daughter was in kindergarten, or maybe it was my son. I think it was my son, with this particular story, was in kindergarten, and we were there for parent-teacher conference, and the teacher said something about reading or whatever, and I was like, oh, he reads. And she had no idea that he could read. I'm like, he's been reading since he was 4, at least. Mm-hmm. And so, he can read, and, he can actually read, how do you not know that? And I remember, being really incensed by the fact that the teacher didn't even know that this little Black boy could actually read already. And he didn't need the same instruction that everybody else was getting necessarily, maybe certain things, but other things he was already past that because he could read. He came into kindergarten reading.
So let's think about that. So what do we do about it? So think about all of this promise that kids bring, all of this talent that they bring, but we're only sort of pulling it out from certain kids. There are patterns to kids who get recognized. There are patterns to kids who get identified as gifted and talented. So what does that mean? What do you think? What do you think would be the first step if we were going to kind of coach somebody through changing that system? What would you say is the first step?
Well, first of all, I think you've got to do the analysis, the data, pull the data. You need to look at what does your data say about your students? Who's enrolled in these courses? Are they girls? Are they boys? Are they Black, white, Latino, Asian, or any other race or ethnicity? Look at who is being identified first and foremost, and how are students being identified?
I think that's crucial.
Right. Yeah. So how are students being identified for this? If it's a teacher recommendation, some kids may get skipped because somebody may say, well, I don't like how this child behaves, or I don't like how this child, shows up late to school, and it may have nothing to do with that child. And so therefore they lose out on an opportunity. But what some schools are doing, and I would say these are more progressive schools, they are getting rid of the criteria, and they're extending gifted and talented honors and AP courses to any child that's interested in being a part of it.
I think that's great.
Right.
I think that's great. And I think that's a step towards removing barriers, removing those systemic barriers that just stop kids from having access and opportunity to these really wonderful kinds of programs that can, light the interest of a burgeoning musician, or a kid or a writer, or something that they might be interested in. So, and I'm also going to extend it beyond education. When we have these recognition programs, I think it's important to take a look at the different types of patterns that might be noticeable. Are there patterns to your employee of the month? Are there patterns to who gets identified for leadership programs?
Right.
Are there patterns to who gets kind of put in the pool for promotions and everything like that? I think that data is is our evidence for whether or not we need to address the way that people get identified for opportunities.
And that's not so hard,
is it?
No,
it isn't. It is not.
It is not. It really seems pretty simple.
I think so.
We would love to know, how do you do things in your community, in your schools, in your organizations? Reach out to us on social media. We're on all the platforms. We would love to hear from you and engage with you over our social media platforms. Yeah. And, we can, be able to share and give you feedback.
Sure.
If you have questions even for us, we'd love to be able to engage with you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Why Is This So Hard?
Yes.
And as we've discussed, maybe it's not so hard.
Maybe it's not.
So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.